There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when the world outside is still, and the only light in the room is the soft glow of a screen. It is the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, the weight of your own body, the slow and steady rhythm of a mind beginning to let go of the day. That is where we are right now. That is where we will stay. Tonight we are going to spend some time together inside a world that most people believe they already understand. A world of crumbled highways and overgrown cities. A world of grey skies over broken buildings. A world where the dead rise and the living do everything they can to hold on. Most people who watch The Walking Dead believe they understood the nature of that world. A virus, society collapses, survivors fight for what remains. The story seemed, on its surface, to be about monsters, about the shambling, groaning things that reached through fences and stumbled through fog and tore apart everything they touched. That was what the show sold you in its opening minutes. A sheriff's deputy wakes up from a coma in an empty hospital. He walks outside into a world that has already ended. He finds a bicycle on the grass and a young girl who turns around to show him her ruined face. And he understands immediately, in the cold, wordless way that certain truths land, that nothing is the way it was. Most people stopped there. Most people accepted that version of the story. But the deeper you move through the expanded universe of The Walking Dead, the more you begin to understand that the surface version of this world was always the least disturbing part of it. The walkers were, in a sense, the simplest thing in this story. They operated on rules you could learn and avoid and eventually adapt to. They were predictable in their hunger. They moved slowly. They did not plan. They did not lie. They did not make strategic decisions about who would live and who would die based on resource modelling and classified briefings and the cold arithmetic of institutional survival. The dead did not do any of that. The living did. And that is what tonight is about. It is about the truths that were buried inside the Walking Dead universe for years, revealed slowly across a web of spin-offs and sequel series and quiet post-credits scenes that most casual viewers never found. Truths about where the virus actually came from. Truths about what it was actually doing inside every surviving human being on the planet, including every character you ever cared about. Truths about a hidden city of 200,000 people and the army that kept them alive through methods that no one inside those walls was allowed to know. Truths about what that army believed about the future of the human race and what they were willing to do to reshape it. Truths about a man you watched for 9 years. A man who gave everything to everyone around him, who found himself trapped inside a civilization he could not escape, quietly falling apart and quietly holding himself together at the same time. These truths do not require you to do anything tonight. They do not ask you to be afraid. They only ask you to settle in, to breathe slowly, to let your body find its rest while your mind moves through the architecture of a world that was built with much more care and much more darkness than most people ever realized. We are going to move through this slowly. There is no rush. The night is long, and the world outside is quiet, and everything we need is right here. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let the space behind your eyes go soft. We begin. The first thing you need to understand about The Walking Dead, the thing that every other truth in this universe is built on top of, is that the world did not end the way Rick Grimes thought it did. When Rick woke up in that hospital room, thin and dehydrated and confused, he had been unconscious for what appeared to be several months. The world he had known, traffic and phones and the hum of everyday civilization, was already completely gone by the time he opened his eyes. He had missed the collapse entirely. He had slept through the end of everything, and what he woke up into was the aftermath. And so his understanding of what had happened was always built on inference and rumour and the things other survivors told him in fragments, because no one alive had the full picture. No one knew where it came from. No one knew exactly how it spread. No one knew why the dead were rising. These were questions that the show carried for years, dropping small pieces of information here and there, never fully committing to an answer, always keeping the mystery at the edges of the frame, where it hummed quietly beneath every other story the show was telling. What is remarkable, looking back, is how much information was hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. The clues were always there, the architecture of the deeper truth was always in place. It just required time and patience and a willingness to follow the story into places that were more uncomfortable than the walkers themselves. So that is what we are going to do. We will start, as the story itself started, with a single man sitting alone in an enormous building, surrounded by equipment he could no longer fully use, watching a clock count down towards something he had come to believe was inevitable. His name was Dr. Edwin Jenner, and what he knew was the first disturbing truth at the center of everything. Take a long, slow breath, let it out completely. Feel the bed or the couch or the floor beneath you, solid and real and holding you up. We are not in a hurry. The world of The Walking Dead has been waiting this long to be understood. It can wait a little longer while you settle. We're going to begin with what Jenner knew. By the time Rick Grimes and his group of survivors reached the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, there was almost nothing left of the place it used to be. The building was still standing, the corridors were still lit, the generator in the basement was still running, though not for much longer. But the sense of purpose that had once filled that building, the urgency, the collective effort, the feeling that human knowledge and human ingenuity were working together against an impossible problem, all of that was gone. What remained was a single man, a virologist named Edwin Jenner, and he was sitting alone in the dark, drinking wine he had found in a supply closet, waiting to die. He had been alone for a long time by then, longer than the others could imagine. His colleagues had left weeks and months before Rick's group ever arrived, slipping out one by one as the hope of finding a solution collapsed around them. Some of them had gone home to be with their families, to find their children or their parents or the people they loved and hold them for whatever time was left. That was the choice that made the most human sense, and most of them made it. The ones who stayed the longest were the ones who could not stop working, who believed until the last possible moment that the answer was just around the corner, just one more test away, just one more sample from the right patient at the right stage of infection. Those people had not gone home, they had gone the other way. When the work finally became impossible and the hope ran out completely, they had not been able to face the world outside those walls, and so they had chosen not to. Jenner had stayed for a different reason. His wife, Dr. Candace Jenner, had been one of the most gifted researchers in the facility. She had worked alongside him for years, understood the virus in ways that few others did, and when she was bitten, when the thing they had been studying and fighting finally reached her, she made a decision that said everything about who she was. She volunteered to be the subject. She allowed her husband and his colleagues to monitor and record the entire process of her infection, her death, and what came after, in the hope that the data they collected might eventually lead to something useful. She became test subject 19, and she asked Jenner as she was dying to keep working for as long as he possibly could. He had promised her he would, and so he stayed. He stayed through the weeks when the building was still full of people. He stayed through the months when it slowly emptied. He stayed through the nights when the generators stuttered and the lights dimmed and the silence of a world without 7 billion people pressed in through the walls. He stayed until the only thing left was the data his wife had given him and the dwindling supply of fuel keeping the building alive. And in all that time, sitting inside what might have been the most important scientific institution in the United States, working with the most sophisticated equipment available for understanding viral infection and neural reanimation, he arrived at 2 pieces of knowledge that would change the understanding of everything. The first piece of knowledge was about the nature of the virus itself, what it did, how it worked, what it turned a human being into. The process began as Jenner showed Rick's group during their one night inside the facility with what he called the first event. The virus invaded the brain like meningitis. It moved into the tissue with a speed and efficiency that was remarkable in the worst possible way, overwhelming the body's immune response before any meaningful defense could be mounted. The adrenal glands hemorrhaged. The brain went into shutdown. The major organs followed. The person died. Everything they had ever been, every memory and preference and fear and love and small particular habit that made them the person their family had known, all of that went dark. Jenna described it plainly, without sentiment, in the way that a man who has watched it happen too many times eventually stops being able to be anything other than precise about it. Everything you ever were or ever will be, he said, gone. But then, after a period of time that varied significantly from case to case, something happened. The brainstem, the most ancient and primitive part of the brain, the part responsible for nothing more sophisticated than the basic physical functions of a living creature, began to reactivate. Not fully, not in any way that resembled consciousness or memory or selfhood. Just enough to get the body moving again. Just enough to drive it forward on the most basic kind of instinct, the kind that existed in biology before thoughts ever appeared. The person was gone. What was left was something that functioned on hunger and motion and the ability to locate and approach living things. The frontal lobe, the neocortex, everything that had made them human. Dark, lifeless, dead. The shell of a person animated by the ghost of an evolutionary drive, so old and so simple that it had outlasted everything that came after it. Jenna had watched this happen on a screen, in high-definition neural imaging, with the woman he loved as the subject. He had watched her brain go dark. He had watched the brainstem flicker back to life. He had watched the reanimation happen in real time, 2 hours and 1 minute and 7 seconds after she died. And he had continued working because he had promised her he would. The data he collected from test subject 19 was eventually destroyed. Not by the collapse of civilization or the failure of the building systems. It was destroyed by an accident inside the facility itself, a decontamination error that wiped out the most valuable samples he had. Jenna described this loss with the particular flatness of someone who had already processed their grief past the point of expression. He had simply continued. He kept the brain scan footage. He maintained his notes. He held on to what remained. But here is what all of that still does not touch. Here is where we arrive at the first deeply disturbing truth inside the Walking Dead universe. The first piece of knowledge Jenna had was about what the virus did to the dead. The second piece of knowledge was about what it was doing to the living. This is the thing that Rick Grimes carried alone for nearly an entire season before he was able to say it out loud to the people around him. This is the thing that Jenna whispered to Rick at the door of the CDC as the building prepared to destroy itself and everyone still inside. It was not a revelation about the origin of the virus or about any hope of a cure or about what was happening in other countries or other cities or other places in the world. It was much simpler than that and much more total. Everyone who was still alive was already infected. Every single living person on the planet was carrying the wildfire virus in their body at all times, not as an active infection, not in a way that was making them sick or causing them any symptoms they could detect, but as a dormant presence in their biology, waiting quietly for one specific trigger. The virus did not need a walker's bite to reach a new host. It was already there. It had been there in every human being on Earth, for as long as anyone could trace the outbreak. The only thing a bite did was accelerate the process. The only thing a bite did was give the virus already living inside you a massive and sudden boost that sped up the timeline. Without a bite, the virus would reach you the same way it reached everyone else eventually, through death. When you died, from whatever cause, from a wound or an illness or old age or any of the 1,000 ways the new world could kill you, the virus would activate, and you would come back. Think about what this means for every character you ever watched in 9 seasons of that show. Think about what it means for every quiet moment of grief, every burial in the woods, every time a character watched someone they loved die and knelt beside the body and said goodbye. They were not just grieving the person, they were standing beside something that was going to try to hurt them in a few minutes if they did not put a blade through the base of its skull. Not because it was evil, not because it wanted to, because the virus would not let it simply be gone. The virus would not allow a clean ending. It would always intervene, always reclaim, always transform whatever had been human into something that was still moving. This truth had been operating in the world of the show from the very first episode. Every dead body Rick stepped over in that hospital corridor was a body that the virus could theoretically reclaim. The rows of corpses wrapped in sheets outside the hospital loading bay were all potential walkers. The world was not simply overrun with the dead. The world was a place where death itself had been fundamentally altered, where the line between dying and turning was a matter of time rather than infection. And nobody knew. Nobody alive in that world, at the time Rick woke up, understood this about their own biology. They understood that walkers existed. They understood that bites were dangerous. But the idea that the virus was already inside them, that there was no version of surviving indefinitely in which you eventually got to simply die and stay dead, that was something almost no one had processed. The CDC scientists had spent the final months of civilization trying desperately to understand the mechanism of infection, and even they had only recently arrived at this conclusion. Most of the people who had died in the early months of the collapse had simply turned without anyone understanding why. Family members who died in their sleep, people who died in hospitals from causes completely unrelated to walker bites, elderly people who passed away peacefully. All of them would have come back, every one of them, and the people closest to them would have had no idea why or how to prevent it. The discovery that Shane Walsh, after being stabbed by Rick Grimes, with no walker bite involved whatsoever, reanimated completely on his own, that was the moment of proof. That was the experiment that confirmed Jenna's science without a laboratory. A man who had been killed by a knife wound to the chest, a man who had not been bitten, a man whose death was entirely standard and entirely human in its cause, lying in a field and then slowly lifting his dead face toward the sky and beginning to move again. It happened in front of Rick. It happened slowly, and Rick understood, in watching it, exactly what Jenna had meant. This truth did not change the show's practical reality in any dramatic way. The characters still needed to survive. They still needed food and shelter and safety and each other. But it changed the philosophical reality of the show entirely. Because it meant that the world they were fighting to rebuild, the world they were making sacrifices for, and fighting wars over, and losing people to maintain, that world had no clean exit. There was no version of the future in which humanity got old and died peacefully and stayed dead. There was no version in which the last walker eventually decomposed and the problem solved itself. As long as human beings were alive, they were already carrying what would make them dangerous when they died. The infection was not a foreign invader that civilization could one day defeat. It was something that had become part of the basic biological reality of every living person on the planet. It was baked into the nature of human death itself. Jenner understood this. He understood it in the cold and complete way that only comes from months of isolation and data and the absence of any comfortable illusion to hide behind. He had sat alone in that enormous building with this knowledge for so long that it had stopped frightening him the way it would have frightened someone hearing it for the first time. It had simply become the central fact of reality. And when he met Rick Grimes and the others at the door of the CDC and let them in out of the darkness, he was not letting in people he believed he could save. He was letting in people he believed deserved one last night of hot water and a decent meal and the faint comfort of a clean room before the world took them again. He whispered his truth to Rick at the last possible moment, at the door, as the building was already beginning the process of destroying itself. He did not announce it to the group. He did not write it on the wall or broadcast it through the facility's speaker system. He chose one person. He told that person quietly, in the chaos of a moment that was already full of noise and urgency and the desperate physical business of trying to get 12 people out of a building before it exploded. And then he let the doors close. And then he stayed inside, holding his dead wife's data in his head, like the last thing of value he had ever owned. And he let the building take him. Robert Kirkman, the creator of the original comic series, later said in an interview that he regretted the CDC episode. He felt it had given away too much information, too early, had introduced a kind of scientific explanation that did not fit the tone he had wanted the story to maintain. He said that if he had done it differently, he would have let the group figure out on their own, organically, through experience and observation, that everyone who died turned regardless of whether they had been bitten. He felt the mystery would have been more powerful that way, the discovery more earned. And he was probably right in a storytelling sense, but the fact that the information exists, the fact that it is canon, that every living human being in the Walking Dead universe is carrying the virus in their body right now, at this moment, in whatever point in the story's timeline you choose to think about. That truth does not lose its weight because of when it was revealed. It only becomes more important the longer you sit with it, because it is the foundation that everything else is built on. It is the first layer of the disturbing architecture underneath this world. Everyone is already infected. The dead do not stay dead. Death itself has been rewritten. And whatever hope remains for the human race is operating inside a biological reality that makes every individual death potentially dangerous to every living person nearby. This was what Jenner carried alone in that building. This was what he chose to tell one man at the last possible moment instead of keeping it entirely to himself. And whether he did it out of compassion or cruelty or some complicated mixture of both, the information survived the building. Rick Grimes carried it into Season 2 and Season 3 and beyond, and it changed the way he understood everything that happened after. The CDC burned, Jenner was gone, the knowledge remained, and somewhere, across an ocean, in a country that most of the characters in this story would never visit, a group of scientists were sitting with a different piece of knowledge altogether. A piece that was even older than Jenner's, a piece that explained not what the virus was doing to the human race, but where it had come from in the first place. Let your breathing stay slow. Let the weight of what you just heard settle somewhere comfortable. We are going to go back further now. We are going to go back to the beginning. For more than a decade, the most important question in the Walking Dead universe was one that the show refused to answer. It was the question behind every other question, the absence at the centre of every piece of analysis and fan theory and late-night conversation about the story. It was the question that even the characters themselves, after a certain point, seemed to have stopped asking, not because they did not want to know, but because the answer had begun to feel irrelevant to the business of surviving. Rick Grimes was asked about it once by a young boy who wanted to know what had caused the walkers, and Rick's answer was honest in the most exhausted possible way. He said he did not know. He said it did not matter. He said what mattered was what was right in front of them, right now, today, and that spending time on the question of origin was a luxury that the new world could not afford. He was right in practical terms. In the immediate daily reality of survival, in a world full of the dead, knowing where the infection came from would not have helped anyone find food or defend a perimeter or keep a sick child from dying. The origin was academic. It was history. It was a question that belonged to a version of the world that no longer existed. But the origin mattered enormously for a different reason. It mattered because it contained a truth that transformed the nature of the catastrophe entirely. It transformed the outbreak from something that had happened to humanity, something that had arrived from outside and could perhaps eventually be addressed as a foreign invader, into something else, something that human beings had done to themselves, something that had been built in a laboratory by scientists with funding and methodology and peer review and all the careful apparatus of institutional research, and had then escaped into the world in a way that those scientists may or may not have fully understood or intended or been able to prevent. The answer came not from the flagship show, but from its spin-off series, a show called The Walking Dead, World Beyond, which aired in 2020 and 2021. It came not as a main story development, but as a post-credits scene, tucked after the final episode's closing credits, designed for the people who stayed in their seats long after the episode was technically over. A scene set in France, a scene inside an abandoned biomedical research facility, a scene with a wall covered in graffiti that translated from the French to 5 words that reframed the entire mythology of the Walking Dead universe. The dead are born here. The facility had the look of a place that had been abandoned in a hurry. Equipment left in the middle of procedures, papers scattered across desks, the particular quality of dust that settles over a place that was once extremely busy and then suddenly completely stopped. A woman arrived in this facility. She was a scientist, a former researcher, and she had come back to the place where the work had been done in the hope of finding something useful, something that might point toward the beginning of a cure, or at least a deeper understanding of what the virus was and how it behaved. She moved through the facility with the careful, purposeful motion of someone who had been thinking about this return for a very long time. And then a man appeared. He was armed. He looked at her with the flat, directed gaze of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, or someone very much like it. And what he said to her was short and unambiguous and devastating. She had told him she wanted to end this. She had said she was there to find a way to stop the outbreak, to contribute whatever remaining knowledge she had to the project of saving what was left of the human race. And his response in French, stripped of any ceremony, was exactly this. End this. You started this. He was not speaking only to her as an individual. He was speaking to what she represented, to the team of researchers, the group of scientists who had worked inside this facility on a project that had, by whatever sequence of accidents or decisions or failures of containment, become the origin point of a global pandemic that had killed billions of people and reduced civilization to scattered groups of survivors fighting over canned food and clean water. The virus had a name inside the official Walking Dead mythology. It was called the wildfire virus, and it was known in the lore accumulated across multiple spin-off series to have originated specifically from this facility. The full name of the organization behind the research was La Biomédecine, DDMI. The scientists who worked there had been organized into teams, each with a name: the Primrose Team, the Violet Team. Others whose names were mentioned only in fragments. Each team had been working on different aspects of the project, and together they had created something that they could not keep contained. The precise mechanism of how it escaped the laboratory remained deliberately ambiguous in everything the show revealed. There was a hint in the French scientist's words when she spoke to the man with the gun. She said that most of her colleagues had not been in the building when it happened. She said specifically, they were not here when it happened, when you all did what you did. That phrasing suggested that the escape of the virus from the facility was not entirely accidental on all sides, that there may have been actors involved in the release who were not the scientists themselves. Who those actors were, what their motivations were, what role they played in the specific moment that the virus moved from a contained laboratory environment into the broader world. The show left all of that in the grey and uncertain space of implication, the way the best horror always does. What it did confirm was a timeline. The wildfire virus was discovered by the Centers for Disease Control in the United States on the 16th of April, 2010. That was the date the CDC first became aware that something unusual was happening with viral activity, that reports were coming in from sources they could not immediately explain. The outbreak moved quickly from there, as outbreaks always do when the pathogen in question is particularly efficient. Cases were scattered at first, isolated incidents that looked, to the media covering them, like instances of extreme aggression or unusual behaviour, the kind of story that gets filed under public health concerns and forgotten between news cycles. But the cases accumulated. The reports became harder to dismiss. And on the 25th of August, 2010, the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control jointly declared the wildfire virus a global pandemic. 6 months from the first detected case to global pandemic. The speed of that spread told you something about the nature of the virus that was more frightening than any laboratory detail could have been. It was already everywhere by the time anyone in a position of authority had enough information to understand what it was. The window for containment, if such a window had ever existed, had closed before most people even knew it had opened. The Primrose team had travelled to the United States from France, to a conference in Toledo, Ohio, according to the available law, arriving as the outbreak was already spreading, which placed the very people who had worked with the virus inside the country's borders during the critical window when containment might still have been possible. The facility that the CDC scientist Dr. Edwin Jenner had been in communication with, the source he referenced in his video recordings that the woman found inside the abandoned building, that was this facility. That was the French biomedical lab. Jenner had been in contact with them during the final months before the CDC's own systems failed. He had referenced their work in his notes. He had included a mention of France in his communications, a mention of the fact that French researchers had thought they were close to a solution. Close to a solution was the phrase he used. Not that they had found one, not that a cure was possible, just that, at some point, the people in that building had believed they were getting close to something. They were not close enough, and then they were gone. But here is where the story deepened in a way that Robert Kirkman himself had not anticipated when he first constructed the show's mythology. Because the French scientists had not simply created the virus and failed to contain it and left the world to deal with the consequences. They had also, in the process of trying to fight what they had created, done something that made it significantly worse. In their effort to develop a countermeasure for the reanimation process, the research teams at LA Biomedicine DDMY had experimented with using cardiac plaques to jumpstart the circulatory system in the infected brain, attempting to divert and confuse the process by which the brainstem reactivated after death. The theory had a logic to it. If the reanimation process worked by allowing the most primitive parts of the brain to restart while the higher functions remained dark, then perhaps introducing circulatory activity could disrupt that process, could force the brain to behave differently at the critical moment of restart, could create a situation where the reanimation either failed entirely or produced something less dangerous. What it produced instead was a variant. The attempt to modify the reanimation process did not eliminate it. It altered it. It created a strain of the wildfire virus that was meaningfully different from the original in the most dangerous possible ways. This variant reduced the reanimation time significantly, meaning that a body infected with this strain would come back faster, giving the people around it less time to respond. It increased the intelligence of the resulting walker, which in the universe of the show was a phrase that carried specific and terrible meaning. Intelligence, in a walker, meant adaptability. It meant the ability to interact with the environment in ways that a simple, mindlessly shambling dead person could not. It meant walkers that could climb walls, walkers that could open doors, walkers that could handle objects, walkers that returned to places they remembered from life, and showed signs faint and terrible of recognition. These were the variants. They appeared first in France, where the modified strain was most concentrated. They appeared in The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon series, which took place largely in France, and confirmed through visual evidence and character testimony that the walker population there behaved in ways that were qualitatively different from what survivors in the United States had been dealing with. One survivor noted specifically that the burner variant, a type of walker whose touch alone could spread a burning infection through living tissue, was just one kind of walker in France, just one. As though the variety of horrors available there had expanded past the point where a single, dominant type could be named. The specific variant that the villain organisation Pouvoir du Vivant weaponized in the Daryl Dixon series took this even further. They had developed a serum that could be administered to an already reanimated walker after the fact that would retroactively alter its biology toward a more extreme version of the variant. They were not creating new walkers, they were upgrading existing ones, taking things that were already dead and already dangerous and making them faster, stronger, and more aggressive through deliberate chemical intervention. This meant that the modification of the wildfire virus, which the French scientists had originally pursued as a countermeasure against the reanimation process, had become a toolkit that people with the right resources and the right absence of ethical constraint could use to build more effective weapons out of the dead. The dead are born here. The words on that wall inside the abandoned facility had a second meaning that became visible the longer you looked at them. They were not just an origin story, they were a confession and a warning simultaneously. They were the words of a place that understood what it had done and had chosen to write it on the wall in the most direct language available, as if the straightforwardness of the graffiti might function as some kind of absolution. We know what happened here. We are not pretending. The dead are born here. There was one more detail in the timeline that connected the French laboratory to the broader Walking Dead universe, in a way that was easy to miss, but important to understand. The canonical timeline of the outbreak established that day one of the event, the moment from which everything else was measured, was the initial outbreak at the facility. Day 628 in that timeline was the end of the Negan War, the conflict that dominated the middle seasons of the flagship show. Rick Grimes's journey from the hospital, from the moment he woke up from his coma and stumbled into the new world, began on day 59. That placed Rick's awakening approximately 2 months after the first outbreak. It placed everything the show depicted inside a timeline that traced directly back to that laboratory in France, to those teams of scientists, to whatever happened on the day the virus escaped. The full extent of what those scientists understood, or intended, was never revealed. The man with the gun had hunted down the researchers responsible, according to the world beyond law, rounding up most of them and killing them or imprisoning them as punishment for what they had done. His group, whoever they were, had taken on the project of accountability in the absence of any functioning legal or governmental system capable of holding anyone responsible. Whether their judgment was just or excessive, or based on a complete understanding of the events, was another question the show chose not to answer. It left those people in the moral grey space where the Walking Dead universe had always been most comfortable. Not villains with clear intentions and clear guilt, but human beings who had been doing something they believed was important and had made an error so catastrophic that the consequences were still unfolding a decade later. The dead are born here, and whatever was done to make them worse, whether by accident or by the desperate logic of researchers trying to create a solution, was also born here. The origin of the Walking Dead universe was not a comet or a divine punishment or a thing that arrived from outside the boundaries of human comprehension. It was a laboratory. It was a team. It was work that was being done. And somewhere in the doing of it, something went wrong, and it went wrong at a scale that ended civilization. The person who came closest to understanding this, who had the most direct access to the data and the timeline and the communications from the French facility, was Dr. Edwin Jenner. And we already know what happened to Jenner. We already know that he stayed in the CDC as the building destroyed itself, carrying his dead wife's research inside his head, unable to save either the world or himself. The knowledge he had was real. The connection he had maintained to the French researchers was real. The whisper he gave Rick Grimes at the door was built on a foundation that extended all the way back to that laboratory, to those graffitied words, to whatever happened on whatever morning the wildfire virus first moved beyond the walls where it had been created. Everything started there. Everything that came after. Every death and every loss, and every impossible choice that every character across every season and every spin-off was forced to make, started there, in France, in a building where people were trying to do something they thought was useful, in a moment of failure that the world never recovered from. There was, of course, another part of the world that had not simply been trying to survive the consequences of that failure. Another part of the world that had been, in the years since the collapse, building something, organising something, accumulating resources and infrastructure, and a carefully maintained secrecy on a scale that made everything the communities Rick Grimes had built look small by comparison. A city, hidden in plain sight, or rather hidden specifically to not be in anyone's sight, in a location that its own allies were not permitted to know. A city of 200,000 people, with electric lights and running water and a functioning government and libraries and schools, and a military force that operated according to rules the civilian population was not allowed to understand. And beneath those rules, a set of actions that were carried out with the calm efficiency of an institution that had decided, long before anyone outside its walls was allowed to know about it, that survival required things that no one would agree to if they were asked. Let the quiet hold you. Let the weight of the night outside the window settle. We are moving into the darkest part of this story now, the part that the show spent years building toward, the part that lived inside an organisation with a name that showed up in strange places, on the sides of helicopters, on canned food, in 3 intersecting rings, before anyone who saw those symbols knew what they meant. You have to understand what 200,000 people means in the context of the Walking Dead universe before you can understand why the city that housed them was able to do what it did. By the timeline of the show's middle and later seasons, the communities that Rick Grimes and his allies had built and protected and fought wars over were measured in hundreds. Alexandria had a few hundred residents at its height. The hilltop was comparable, the kingdom somewhat larger. These were not small groups of survivors huddled in a basement. They were genuine attempts at civilization, with walls and crops and governance structures and people who had been born after the outbreak and who had never known any other world. They were meaningful achievements. They had been earned through enormous sacrifice, and they were vulnerable in ways that their residents understood deeply, because the math of their vulnerability was always visible. If the walls came down, if the crops failed, if disease moved through a population of 300 people with no medical infrastructure, the margins were razor thin. 200,000 people changes that math entirely. 200,000 people is a city. Not a settlement or a community or a colony, but a city, with all the complexity and institutional depth that the word implies. It is enough people to maintain specialization, enough for some individuals to be farmers, and others to be doctors, and others to be engineers, and others to be teachers, without the whole structure collapsing if any single function is temporarily disrupted. It is enough people to accumulate genuine political power, to sustain a military force of meaningful size, to maintain infrastructure that a smaller community could never have rebuilt from nothing. 200,000 people in the world of The Walking Dead was not just a number, it was a different category of existence entirely. The Civic Republic of Philadelphia was that city. Its location was a secret. Not a casual secret, not the kind of thing people simply did not discuss. A formal, enforced, institutional secret, protected by rules that were written into the founding documents of the city and backed by the full force of its military. People who were brought into the civic republic from outside were required to keep its location completely confidential. They were not allowed to tell anyone where they were going before they arrived, and they were not allowed to tell anyone where they had been after the fact. The location of the city was, as the military leadership described it, the bedrock of the community's security. The idea was that if no one outside the walls knew where the city was, no one could attack it, no one could lay siege to it, no one could threaten it in the way that every other community in the post-collapse world had eventually been threatened. This logic was not entirely unreasonable. Secrecy as a survival strategy had a real basis in the world the show depicted, but the particular version of secrecy that the Civic Republic military practiced extended well beyond simply keeping the city's coordinates off the map. It extended into a system of classification and control that shaped every interaction the military had with the outside world, and that classified the people who interacted with the CRM in ways that had life and death consequences. The classification system was called, simply, the A and B designations. People encountered by CRM operatives in the outside world were assessed and sorted into one of two categories. B designations were everyday survivors, people who were simply trying to live, who had no particular capacity for leadership or resistance or the kind of influence that could challenge the established order. Bs were brought into the Civic Republic as valuable additions to the population, as labour and expertise and genetic diversity. They were welcomed in a limited and controlled way into the larger project of civilization that the city represented. Designations were different. As were people who displayed what the CRM leadership characterized as strength, specifically the kind of strength that other people followed. Leaders, people around whom communities formed, people with the particular quality of presence and judgment and will that caused others to orient toward them in crisis situations. People who, if left in the outside world, would build things and gather people and create organizations that could eventually accumulate enough power to constitute a threat to the Civic Republic's secrecy and security. As were sent away and killed. This was not presented as an exceptional measure or a tragic necessity that the CRM undertook reluctantly. It was a systematic policy applied with bureaucratic consistency to everyone who met the criteria. The A/B distinction was operational from the earliest days of the CRM's reach into the outside world, and it was enforced by operatives whose job it was to assess and report on the people they encountered. An A designation was a death sentence carried out not loudly or dramatically, but quietly, efficiently, in the context of 1,000 small operational decisions that none of the Civic Republic's 200,000 civilian residents ever saw or were asked to approve. Rick Grimes, as you may have already understood, was an A. He had been designated as such from the moment Jadis, the woman who led the survivor group called the Scavengers, handed him over to the CRM helicopter. Jadis had been operating as a CRM informant for some time before that, exchanging people for supplies in a system that the show eventually revealed in its full ugliness. She was not the only one. The CRM had cultivated a network of informants and traffickers in the outside world, people who were willing to provide the organization with human subjects in exchange for the resources that made survival possible in their corner of the post-collapse landscape. The people handed over through this system went somewhere. They became research subjects, they became labor, they became test cases for experiments that the CRM was conducting inside its research facility in Ithaca, New York. But Rick had been designated an A, and A's were killed. The fact that he was not killed immediately on arrival was the result of one specific intervention. One person inside the CRM structure who had seen something in Rick Grimes that made him willing to violate the protocol and absorb the consequences of doing so. That person was Lieutenant Colonel Donald Okafor, a former Air Force officer who had been part of the CRM's founding and who had his own complicated relationship with the organization's methods and its future. Okafor lobbied for Rick. He used whatever political capital he had accumulated over years of service to argue that Rick's designation should be treated differently, that Rick was a person whose qualities could be useful to the CRM rather than a threat that needed to be eliminated. And because of that single act of advocacy, Rick Grimes survived a system designed to kill people like him. But the A/B classification system was only one layer of what the Civic Republic military was doing. The deeper layer, the one that only became visible years into the expanded story, involved what the CRM had done to the communities it had officially been allied with. The Alliance of the Three was the name given to the partnership between the Civic Republic and two other major survivor settlements, Portland, Oregon on the west coast, and Omaha, Nebraska in the middle of the country, along with its associated satellite community called the Campus Colony, a settlement built around what had been Nebraska State University, housing nearly 10,000 people in addition to Omaha's own population. The alliance had been established in the early years after the outbreak, built on the premise of mutual support and resource sharing, and the collective project of rebuilding something resembling civilization. The three communities represented between them a significant fraction of the surviving human population in the United States. They exchanged expertise and technology and personnel. They operated under a three-ring symbol that appeared on their shared materials, representing the union of three distinct communities working toward a common purpose. The Campus Colony sent its best scientific minds to the Civic Republic Research Facility. Portland contributed resources and labor. Omaha contributed the stability of a large established community with significant agricultural capacity. The civilian population of the Civic Republic knew about the alliance in broad strokes. They knew that their city had partners. They knew that the three-ring symbol on certain food cans represented a cooperative relationship with communities in other parts of the country. What they did not know, what the CRM's classification system was specifically designed to ensure they never knew, was what those communities actually meant to the military's strategic planning. What the CRM had decided the alliance was worth, and what they intended to do about it. In 2018, according to the internal timeline established by the show, the CRM's modelling teams produced an assessment of the alliance's long-term sustainability. The analysis concluded that Portland and Omaha would never become fully self-sufficient. The resources required to maintain the exchange relationship, to provide the food and supplies and personnel that kept the allied communities functional, were draining from the Civic Republic at a rate that the models projected would eventually become catastrophic. The projected outcome, if nothing changed, was a chain reaction of crises. First famine in the allied communities as the supply relationship strained, then disease and conflict as the famine created pressure, then the spread of those consequences into the Civic Republic itself as the organisation struggled to manage the fallout from communities it had committed to supporting but could no longer sustain. The conclusion of the assessment was that the alliance was not sustainable. The conclusion of the assessment was that the allied communities would have to be removed. The word removed is the institutional language. The operational language was different. What the CRM did on a day that the alliance's calendar marked as Monument Day, a date that was supposed to be a celebration of the partnership, a commemoration of the years of cooperation between the three communities, was use chlorine gas. They deployed it against Omaha, against a city of 97,407 people, against the surrounding community of the Campus Colony, with its 9,671 additional residents, against over 100,000 people who were, at that moment, living their lives inside walls they believed were protected, receiving food that arrived bearing the three-ring symbol they had been taught to associate with safety and alliance and the reassurance of being part of something larger than themselves. 107,000 people, approximately. The CRM gassed them. And then, to ensure that the story of what happened would not raise questions that the CRM could not answer, they lured a massive walker herd to the ruins of the communities and blew open the defensive walls, allowing the herd to move through the space where the people had been. They staged the evidence. They constructed a narrative. The official version that was presented to Portland, to the civilian population of the Civic Republic, to anyone who asked, was that the walker herds had overrun the communities, that the dead had taken Omaha and the campus colony the way the dead had taken so many other settlements in the decades since the collapse. Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Kublek, the CRM officer who oversaw and carried out the operation, gave a video address to the surviving communities. She spoke about tragedy. She invoked the language of loss and solidarity and the determination to go on. She said that these tragedies would serve as a clarion call for the military to stand even more firmly resolved. She said the CRM was ready to fight for the survival of humankind. She said it in the carefully modulated tones of someone who has practiced the performance of grief without the experience of it. She said it while standing in front of a camera, knowing that more than 100,000 people had died in the hours before she began speaking, knowing that she had given the order, knowing that the bodies were still in the buildings, and the herd was still moving through the ruins. The campus colony had been home to people who had grown up inside the Alliance's promise. They had been born into or found their way to a community that was formally partnered with the largest and most sophisticated survivor civilization in the country. They had received food with the 3-ring symbol on it. They had known that out there, somewhere in a location they were not permitted to know, there was a city of 200,000 people that was in some meaningful sense on their side. The security that came from that knowledge, false as it turned out to be, constructed specifically to serve the CRM's purposes, was real to them in the way that all emotional security is real. They had organized their lives around it, in small ways, the way people do when they have reason to believe that they are not entirely alone. They were not warned. No one was given a choice. No one was evacuated. The CRM did ensure, in the coldly pragmatic terminology of their internal documentation, that all assets were extracted before the operation was carried out. The scientists whose work the CRM considered valuable were brought to the research facility in the days before the attack. The children, 10,000 of them, were removed. The most useful individuals, assessed through the A/B classification system, were identified and either incorporated into the Civic Republic's population or disposed of according to their designation. What remained after the assets had been taken was the rest. The people who had not been classified as useful. The people who had been assessed and found to be, in the CRM's brutal arithmetic, a drain rather than a resource. Those were the people who stayed. Those were the people who were still in the buildings when the gas arrived. There was a sergeant major named Barsa who questioned the order. He looked at the aftermath of the campus colony massacre and asked a question that the CRM's command structure had no satisfying answer to. He asked why. The people of the campus colony had been innocent, he said. They had not been a threat. They had not been planning anything. They had not been accumulating weapons or organizing a resistance or doing anything that could be characterized as a danger to the Civic Republic's security. They had simply been living inside walls, eating the food the CRM provided, trusting the arrangements they had been offered. Lieutenant Colonel Kublek's answer to this question was delivered in the flat, assured language of institutional certainty. She acknowledged that the campus colony residents were not currently a threat, and that word, currently, was quietly carrying the full weight of the decision. Not guilty of anything, not a threat today, but projected to become one. That distinction between what something was and what a model said it would become was where the justification lived, and where the horror of it lived too. This is the logic of institutions under extreme pressure, taken to its absolute limit. It is not an unfamiliar logic in the history of the world before the collapse. It is the logic that converts a projection into a justification, that allows an assessment of future risk to function as grounds for present action, that permits people who are not guilty of anything to be treated as though the potential they represent for future harm is equivalent to harm already done. It is the logic that requires the people using it to believe, with complete conviction, that the calculation they have made is correct, that the model is accurate, that the future it describes will come true if the action is not taken. It is the logic that does not leave much room for the possibility that the model might be wrong, that the future is genuinely uncertain, that there might have been another way. The CRM did not appear to entertain those doubts publicly. The command structure had made its assessment, drawn its conclusions, and acted on them with the efficiency that an organization of that size and training was capable of. They had managed to access the CRM's chlorine gas supply, held at a facility called Civic Republic Coal Facility 1. A soldier named Jennifer Malik, who had played a specific and terrible role in the operation against the campus colony by providing reconnaissance that the CRM had used to plan the attack more precisely, sacrificed herself to destroy the gas supply and prevent the operation against Portland from going forward. Portland was warned. Portland survived. But Portland's survival did not undo Omaha. It did not bring back the campus colony. It did not change what had been done or restore any of the people who had been killed. It was an intervention that came after the fact of the most significant atrocity committed by any human organization in the post-collapse world that the show depicted. More people died in the CRM's operation against Omaha and the campus colony than in any of the wars between communities that the flagship show had ever depicted. More people died than in the assault on the prison, or the fall of the governor's community, or any of the battles with the saviors, or any of the conflicts of the show's later seasons. More people, by an enormous margin, killed by an organization that had been explicitly framing its mission as the protection and preservation of the human race. The people of the Civic Republic did not know. The civilian government, the council that was supposed to be overseeing the military and eventually transitioning into full control of the city, had not been consulted. They had not been told what the echelon briefing contained. They had not been told about Omaha. The city they lived in, with its electric lights and running water and functioning schools, had been quietly operating a military force that committed genocide in their name. For their survival, without their knowledge or their consent, they were protected from information about their own protection, the way children are sometimes protected from the realities of what their parents do to keep them safe, with the understanding that knowing would be harmful, that the knowledge itself would constitute a kind of damage that the people in charge had decided they could not afford to inflict. This is the deepest structure of what the Civic Republic military was. Not simply a powerful organization with ruthless methods, though it was that. It was an institution that had decided, at the level of its foundational philosophy, that the people it served could not be trusted with the truth of what was being done to protect them, that the survival of humanity, the phrase the CRM returned to again and again, the phrase that functioned as the justification for everything, required a set of actions that were so extreme and so morally disqualifying that they could not be subjected to civilian oversight or democratic accountability without collapsing. The CRM's leadership believed that they alone had the clarity, the discipline, and the willingness to do what was necessary, and that keeping everyone else in the dark was part of the job, not a corruption of the mission. The mission. There was one more thing, one additional layer of darkness beneath even this, that the CRM's most senior leadership had access to, and that most of the organization's own membership did not know. A briefing so classified that only 2,533 soldiers out of the entire CRM force had ever received it. A briefing that contained the most important and most terrifying assessment the organisation had ever produced. It was called the Echelon Briefing, and what it contained was not a plan for rebuilding civilization, or a status update on the Alliance's replacement communities, or an operational overview of the next phase of the CRM's expansion. What it contained was a number, a timeline, a projection produced by the same modelling teams that had determined Omaha was unsustainable, about the future of the human race itself. Breathe slowly. Let the room around you be quiet. The next part of this story is the part that puts everything else in its full context. The part that explains not just what the CRM did, but why they had decided that what they were doing was the only option left. Major General Jonathan Beale was not the kind of character that shows about apocalypse survival typically produced. He was not a screaming warlord, or a cartoonish tyrant, or a man who had been visibly broken by the new world and rebuilt himself around cruelty as a coping mechanism. He was something considerably more unsettling, a man who appeared entirely coherent, entirely committed, and entirely convinced that everything he had done and everything he intended to do was not simply justified, but necessary in a way that left no room for argument. He had the bearing of an institution. The Civic Republic military was, in a very real sense, him. He had built it, or helped to build it, from the pieces of the Pennsylvania National Guard that had survived the Second Civil War in the early months of the outbreak. And in the decades since then, he had shaped it into the most powerful military organization in the post-collapse United States. Through a combination of discipline, resource management, and a willingness to make decisions that no one else in any position of comparable authority had been willing to make. He was from Pittsburgh. This was a detail he disclosed personally. He said it without apology, in the way a person says something they have made their full peace with. He had taken out the entire city of Pittsburgh in the period before the show's main timeline in order to protect Philadelphia, in order to ensure that the resources and the security and the future of the Civic Republic were not compromised by a competing centre of organised human population nearby. Pittsburgh, with however many thousands of survivors it had managed to accumulate by that point, had been assessed as a threat or a liability and had been eliminated. Not by walkers, not by disease, by the Civic Republic military, using methods that Beale was willing to describe with the same flat institutional clarity he applied to all his decisions. He had done this. He had lived with having done this. He had continued doing his job afterward, not despite it, but in some sense because of it, because having made that decision and carried it through had confirmed for him the particular philosophy of survival he had been developing since the outbreak began. The philosophy that said that the scale of the threat the human race was facing made conventional morality an unaffordable luxury. That said that the people with the capacity to make hard decisions had an obligation to make them, regardless of whether the people those decisions affected would ever understand or consent to them. That said that the alternative to ruthlessness in the face of extinction was extinction, and that choosing extinction out of an unwillingness to be ruthless was not virtue but cowardice, dressed up as principle. This is the framework inside which the Echelon Briefing needs to be understood, because the briefing was not simply an operational document or a classified intelligence assessment. It was the foundation of Beale's worldview, expressed in the most brutal terms that the mathematics of survival could produce. It was the thing that justified everything else, and the number at its centre, the specific projection that Beale had built his entire strategy around, was 14 years. 14 years was the CRM's modelling team's assessment of how long non-necrotic human life, the technical phrase for people who were still alive and not in the process of reanimating, had before it reached effective extinction. Not 14 years before civilization collapsed further, or before things got significantly harder, or before some tipping point was reached that would require significant adjustment. 14 years before human beings, as a category of living things on this planet, ceased to exist in any meaningful number. Before the last viable population went below the threshold of demographic sustainability. Before the combination of the walker herds and disease and starvation and the long-term consequences of a decade of collapse had worked their way through the remaining survivors to a point where there were simply not enough of them left to recover. Beale presented this number to Rick Grimes during the echelon briefing that Rick received as part of the process of being elevated within the CRM's command structure. He presented it without theatrics, without the kind of emotional weight that a person encountering the idea for the first time would naturally bring to it. He'd been living with this number for years. It had the quality, in his delivery, of something he had absorbed so completely that it no longer had the capacity to disturb him. He stated it the way a general states any other operational parameter. The situation is this, the timeline is this, these are the constraints within which we are working. He had begun the briefing with the first secret, the one that set the tone for everything that followed. The most likely outcome, he told Rick, after all the fighting and all the killing, after all the plans and all the sacrifices, was that they would lose. Most likely outcome, he said. Not worst case scenario, not the grim possibility you prepared for while hoping to avoid. The most likely outcome. The baseline expectation. The result that the models projected as most probable given the current trajectory of human survival worldwide. They were going to die, most of them, and then the rest of them, and then whatever few stragglers remained would not be enough to constitute a species anymore. And then those would die too, and the walkers would inherit a world that had been handed to them not by any dramatic last battle or final catastrophe, but by the slow, grinding arithmetic of attrition. 14 years. The young academic who had been part of the campus colony before it was destroyed had arrived at a similar number from a different direction. He had projected 15 years, based on his own modelling of the Holocene extinction event and the specific dynamics of how human population density and walker herd density were interacting across the continent. His frame was biological and historical rather than military and operational, but it landed in almost the same place. He had described it as the conclusion of the Holocene extinction, the sixth extinction event in the planet's history, following a sequence of mass die-offs across geological time that had each remade the biosphere in ways that took millions of years to stabilize. He had said that human beings were at the conclusion, not approaching it, not in danger of approaching it, at it, standing at the edge of something that, once crossed, would not be reversible. What Beale's echelon briefing added to this assessment was the CRM's response to it, because the projection of 14 years was not simply a number Beale had contemplated in despair and then accepted as fate. It was the premise of a strategy. It was the starting point of a plan. And the plan, as Beale explained it to the soldiers who received the briefing, was exactly what the CRM had already been doing, scaled up and made explicit. The CRM destroys communities for resources, for strategic superiority, and to ensure the city's secrecy and security above all. Beale said this. He said it plainly to Rick in the echelon briefing as a description of established policy rather than a disclosure of something shameful. The CRM would eliminate competitors. It would take their resources. It would ensure supremacy. Not because it wanted power for its own sake, not because the people running it were personally interested in domination, but because the math of the 14-year timeline demanded it. If the human race had 14 years, then every resource spent supporting a community that was not the Civic Republic was a resource that could not be used to extend that timeline. Every competing organization that accumulated enough strength to potentially threaten the Republic was a threat that needed to be neutralized before it could develop. Every city that was not Philadelphia was eventually a drain. And drains, in a 14-year timeline, were not a luxury the human race could afford. The plan for Portland, the operation that would have followed the destruction of Omaha in the Alliance sequence was part of a larger operational vision that Beale had described in the briefing. The CRM would activate its operatives. Portland would be destroyed. Martial law would be declared in the Civic Republic. The Civilian Council, which had been waiting for a decade for the promised transition of power from military to civilian governance, would be removed. The CRM would march across the country, the Commonwealth in Ohio, the Tanktown oil fields in Texas. Every significant accumulation of survivors and resources in the continental United States would be either absorbed or eliminated, their people and their supplies redirected toward the singular project of keeping the Civic Republic viable long enough to outlast the extinction timeline. The last light of the world, Beale called it. The Civic Republic was the last light. Everything he did was in service of keeping it burning. There was a provision in the founding compact of the Civic Republic, the document that had been written in the earliest days of the city's existence by the people who had survived the Second Civil War and built something in its aftermath, that specified a transition of power. The compact stated that after 10 years of military governance, if the city had stabilized to a point where civilian oversight was viable, control would transfer from the CRM to the Civilian Council. That 10-year mark arrived. The city had stabilized. The council was preparing for the transition, and Major General Beale and Lieutenant Colonel Kublik had already decided, well before the deadline, that the transition was not going to happen. The military was not going to give up the governance of the city it had built and the strategy it had been running, because the echelon briefing said they had 14 years, and 14 years was not enough time to let civilian politicians second-guess operational decisions that the modelling had already made. The destruction of Omaha timed to Monument Day, the celebration of the Alliance, was not simply a resource management decision. It was also a political operation. By blaming the destruction of Omaha on the Walkers and declaring an emergency in the aftermath, the CRM successfully delayed the transition of power that the founding compact had promised. The emergency they created gave them justification to maintain their military governance structure. The civilian population, grieving the loss of their alliance partners and frightened by the apparent vulnerability of large communities even within the alliance framework, did not push back the way they might have under other circumstances. The CRM had engineered its own justification for remaining in power, and it had done so by killing more than 100,000 people. What made all of this particularly difficult to hold was not the scale of it, though the scale was enormous. It was the internal coherence. Beale was not wrong about the 14-year timeline in any way that was clearly demonstrable within the show's universe. The modelling might have been correct. The projection might have been accurate. The math that drove him to Pittsburgh and Omaha and the plan for Portland might have been the right math, might have genuinely represented the only remaining path to human survival in a world where all the comfortable paths had already been closed. The show was careful never to definitively contradict his assessment. It allowed the possibility that he believed what he said, that the data supported what he claimed, that his decisions were not the product of a broken psychology, but of a genuinely desperate calculation made by a man who understood the situation more clearly than anyone else alive. And that is what made it so disturbing. Not the evil, but the logic. Not the madness, but the sanity. The possibility that the most monstrous institutional behaviour in the Walking Dead universe was not the result of a system run by people who had lost their humanity, but a system run by people who believed, with complete and terrible conviction, that they were the last guardians of it. Rick Grimes received this briefing. He stood in a room with Beale and listened to the 14-year timeline and the plan to destroy Portland and the acknowledgement of Omaha and Pittsburgh and the explicit statement that the CRM's strategy was to become the only thing left. He listened to all of it, and he understood. in the way that Rick Grimes had always understood things, not through the channels of ideology or philosophy, but through something more physical and immediate, through his sense of what was real, what was human, what was worth fighting for, that the logic was wrong. Not wrong in a mathematical sense, not wrong in a way he could argue against in the language of Beale's own framework. Wrong in the deeper sense that matters more than math when you're talking about whether the survival of the human race is worth having. Because a version of the human race that survived by becoming the Civic Republic military, by becoming the thing that gassed Omaha and destroyed Pittsburgh, and was planning Portland and had run a decade of classified operations that its own citizens were not allowed to know about. That version of the human race had not preserved the essential thing. It had kept the biology alive. It had maintained the heartbeat, but the thing that made human survival worth the effort, the thing that made the preservation of people different from the preservation of any other animal that happened to be endangered, the thing that Rick Grimes had been fighting for across 9 years and countless losses, that was gone from Beale's plan. It had been the first casualty long before Omaha. Rick Grimes had come into this system as a prisoner. He had been held against his will for years. He had tried to escape 4 times. He had sacrificed something permanent and irreplaceable in one of those attempts. And eventually, with Michonne, he had found a way to do what he had always done, to hold the line where no one else would. But that story, the story of what Rick endured inside the Civic Republic, and what it cost him, and what he found there, and what he had to become in order to survive it, that story deserves its own space, its own time, its own careful telling. Let your body be heavy. Let the muscles in your neck and shoulders release toward the surface beneath you. We are past the halfway point now. The worst of the institutional darkness has been named and set out in the open. What comes next is smaller in scale, but no less heavy. It is the story of one man, and of what years of captivity and isolation and the impossibility of getting home does to a person who is built for exactly the opposite of all of those things. There is a bridge in the Walking Dead universe that most people who watch the show know well. It stood in the middle of a landscape that had already been through more than any landscape should have to survive. It was not a beautiful bridge. It was not famous or historic or architecturally significant. It was a bridge the way all bridges are bridges, a structure designed to carry people from one side to another, to make a crossing possible that would otherwise be impossible. And on that morning, Rick Grimes walked onto it with a specific understanding of what he was going to do. He had a herd behind him, a massive Walker herd, drawn by explosions and sound toward the bridge, in a controlled and deliberate way that was the result of careful planning by the communities that Rick had spent years building and protecting. The plan was to lead the herd across the bridge and detonate it, to destroy the crossing and eliminate the herd in a single operation that would protect the communities on either side from a threat that had been accumulating for weeks. The plan required someone to be on the bridge when it detonated. The plan required someone to draw the herd far enough across the structure before the explosions went off. And Rick, in the final moments before the detonation, understood that he was the one who was going to stay. The people who loved him watched from a distance. They watched the bridge light up. They watched the explosion take the herd and the structure, and as far as any of them could tell, the man who had led them to that moment. Michonne, Daryl, Carol. All the people who had known Rick Grimes long enough to have their understanding of survival shaped by his presence in it. They grieved from across the water, and then they went on, because going on was the only thing the world they were in allowed. He was not dead. He had been found in the river below the bridge by a helicopter, barely alive, his body carrying the damage of someone who had been close to an explosion and survived it by the narrowest margin that survival allowed. The helicopter belonged to the Civic Republic military. The person in the helicopter was Jadis, the former leader of the Scavengers, who had known about the CRM's operations for long enough to have developed her own relationship with them. She had assessed Rick Grimes according to the A/B classification system. She had decided, in the particular calculus of her own survival, that he represented something worth handing over. And so she had. He arrived at the Civic Republic as a consignee. This was the term the CRM used for people who had been brought into the organisation from outside and who had not yet completed the formal process of citizenship. Consignment was a kind of probationary status with significant constraints. Consignees lived in the Civic Republic's territory, but not within the main city. They worked in clearance operations, using their abilities to eliminate walker threats in the territory surrounding the community. They were supervised, they were evaluated, their access to the city itself was controlled, and they were not allowed to leave. No one was allowed to leave. This was not a rule that applied only to consignees. It was a fundamental policy of the Civic Republic's security doctrine. The location of the city was a secret, and maintaining that secret required that no one who knew the location could move freely in the outside world. Citizens born inside the city were citizens for life, geographically. Consignees who completed their term and earned citizenship exchanged one set of constraints for another. The walls were different. The quality of life inside them was considerably higher. But the fundamental condition, you are here and you will stay here, and the outside world is not an option available to you, was the same for everyone. Rick Grimes had been many things in his life before arriving at the Civic Republic. A sheriff's deputy in a small Georgia county who had been proud of doing his job with integrity. A father, a husband, a leader of desperate people who had needed someone to organize their survival and had found in Rick someone who could do that in a way that was both effective and human, that kept the work of survival from consuming the parts of a person that made survival worth having. He had led Alexandria, he had built alliances, he had fought wars and endured losses, and rebuilt from them, again and again, in the particular way that the Walking Dead's central character was always doing. Not easily, not without cost, not without periods of genuine breakdown, but persistently. None of that history transferred cleanly to the Civic Republic. In the Civic Republic, Rick Grimes was a number. He was a consignee with a designation, working in clearance operations, living in an apartment in the institutional space between the city walls and the outer territory, eating food he was provided, sleeping in a bed he had not chosen, waking up every morning inside a system that had no interest in who he had been before it acquired him. The Civic Republic was large enough and sophisticated enough to metabolize a person like Rick without disrupting anything. There were thousands of consignees. There was an entire administrative apparatus for managing them. His presence was a small data point in a very large operational picture. He tried to escape 4 times. The first attempts happened in the years when he was still operating on the assumption that escape was possible, that the system had vulnerabilities he could identify and exploit, that the people around him could be worked with, or around, or past in a way that would eventually get him back to the bridge, back to Georgia, back to the people who believed he was dead and who he had never stopped carrying in some quiet corner of every day. Those attempts failed. They failed because the CRM was very good at what it did. They failed because the Civic Republic's security apparatus had been designed specifically to address the problem of people who did not want to stay. They failed because Rick Grimes, for all his qualities, was operating without resources or allies or the network of relationships that had made him effective in the world he had come from. The most significant attempt, the one that changed his physical reality in a permanent way, happened when the CRM took a group of consignees to a burning forest to deal with a walker hazard at the edge of the territory. The consignees were tethered to CRM soldiers, connected by physical restraints that kept them close and operational during the clearance work. Rick identified the moments when the chaos of the operation created a window, brief, imperfect, the only kind of window the Civic Republic ever offered, and he took it. He used his belt as a tourniquet. He positioned himself correctly and he cut off his own hand. He did not do this because it was the right thing to do in any conventional sense. He did it because it was the only thing available in that moment that created any possibility at all. The tether that connected him to a CRM soldier ran to his wrist. The only way to remove the tether was to remove the wrist. The choice was not between a good option and a bad option. It was between two bad options, and the bad option that offered any chance of freedom was the one that required him to become permanently and irreversibly different from what he had been. He bled into the body of a walker and cauterized the wound against its interior tissue. Using the heat of the biological reaction, he induced to stop the bleeding in the most immediate and brutal way available. And then a CRM soldier tasered him and brought him back. The escape failed. The hand was gone. The only thing Rick got out of it was the confirmation that he would try again. That no version of the calculation he ran on his own survival changed the fundamental priority, which was getting back to his children, to the family that thought he was dead, to Michonne, specifically, who had a piece of him that he had been thinking about every day in the apartment in the Civic Republic's consignee territory, where he scratched messages onto the surfaces of iPhones with whatever sharp object he could find. Messages for someone who might find them, messages that said he was alive and where he was and that he had not stopped. Years passed, the weight of years spent away from the people you love, in circumstances you did not choose, in a place that will not let you leave, doing work that does not reflect anything about who you are. That weight accumulates differently from other kinds of weight. It does not add up in a linear way, it compounds. Each day carries not just its own difficulty, but the difficulty of all the days before it, the days within days that constitute the texture of captivity. Rick Grimes had been through enormous things before the Civic Republic. He had survived losses that should have been unsurvivable. He had processed grief in the field, in real time, without the luxury of stopping. But this was different from any of that, because it had no visible shape. It had no enemy he could fight or wall he could defend. It had only the slow daily fact of a life being lived in the wrong place. His friend inside the compound, a man named Esteban, who'd been a consignee for 6 years before earning his citizenship, tried to offer perspective. Esteban was a man who had made a genuine peace with the Civic Republic, who had found meaning inside its structure and was genuinely looking forward to the life waiting for him on the other side of his consignment. He was kind to Rick in the particular way that people who have found acceptance sometimes are with people who have not. Not condescending, not dismissive, but genuinely incapable of fully bridging the gap between their experience and the other person's. He acknowledged that he understood why Rick saw the city as Alcatraz. For Rick, that was exactly what it was. But Esteban himself had found something worth holding in this place, and he was genuinely looking forward to the life waiting for him on the other side of his consignment period. There was a man named Okafor who mattered more. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Okafor, the former Air Force officer who had defected during the Second Civil War and bombed the military instead of the city he had been ordered to bomb, saving Philadelphia and contributing to the founding of the Civic Republic, was the person who had intervened to keep Rick alive when his A designation should have gotten him killed. He had done this because he believed that Rick represented something the CRM needed and did not currently have. Not obedience, not tactical skill, though Rick had that. Not even those military qualities that made a good soldier. Something less tangible and more essential. Okafor had watched the CRM become the thing it was becoming. He had been inside it long enough to see the trajectory. He had heard Beale's echelon briefing and understood the math of 14 years and the logic of elimination and the plan for the continent. And he had arrived at a different conclusion than Beale had. Not that the threat was wrong, not that the timeline was comfortable, or that the situation was anything other than desperate, but that the method was creating something that was not worth saving. An institution capable of Omaha was not the last light of the world. It was a different kind of darkness, and he wanted Rick and a woman named Pearl Thorne, another consignee who had also been designated an A, and also survived by the intervention of Okafor's advocacy to help him change it from the inside. He gave them books. He talked to them in tunnels where the conversations could not be monitored. He outlined a path that ran through the CRM's own hierarchy, up through the ranks, past the layers of classification, toward Force Command, and eventually toward the echelon briefing itself, toward the place where the decisions were made, and where, if the right people were positioned in the right places, it might be possible to apply pressure in a direction that Beale and Kublik and the current leadership had never anticipated. He was not asking them to be traitors. He was asking them to be something the CRM's founding had intended and then gradually abandoned. People who understood that the means mattered, that an institution willing to do anything to survive had already given up the thing that made survival meaningful. Okafor died before he could see where the path led. He was killed in a helicopter attack while Rick was flying him over the coast, hit by explosives that destroyed the helicopter and killed Okafor and his men. What Rick and Thorne found at the crash site was Michonne. 6 years after the bridge, 6 years of believing each other gone and lost and dead, standing on a dark field in front of each other with years of separation visible in the way they held themselves, the way their faces moved, the particular quality of stillness that comes over a person when they encounter something they had stopped allowing themselves to believe was possible. That reunion could not have happened between two people who were unchanged by what they had been through. The years had done their work on both of them. Rick had become someone who had cut off his own hand and survived it and kept going. Michonne had become someone who had travelled alone across a post-collapse landscape, looking for evidence of a person who might not be alive, having left her children behind at the community they had built together, and carrying the kind of grief that refuses to fully close because the evidence against hope was never quite complete enough. They were both different. They were both in ways that would take time and difficulty to fully understand, still themselves. The work that followed, the work of understanding what the Civic Republic military was and what its plans were and how to expose those plans to the people who deserved to know them. That was the work that eventually brought Beale's echelon briefing to light, that eventually resulted in the CRM's leadership being destroyed and the Civilian Council of the Civic Republic beginning the process of reform that the founding compact had always promised and the military had always prevented. But the cost of getting there, the specific personal cost to Rick Grimes, was not recoverable the way some costs are. He had spent years in a place that had taken his hand, taken his time, taken the years his children grew without him, taken the years Michonne lived without him. None of those years would come back. None of that time would be restored. He would go home eventually, or find a version of home in whatever the new world allowed, but he would go home as someone who had been through things that the people waiting for him had not been through with him, and that gap, the particular gap between what a person has survived alone and what the people who love them know, does not close easily. It closes over time if you let it, if you're patient, if you're willing to carry the weight of what you have been through without demanding that the people you love carry it in exactly the same way. Rick Grimes had always been good at that kind of patience in the end. It had been the thing that kept him going through every version of impossible the show had put in front of him. Not the absence of grief or fear, or the wish that things were different, but the capacity to keep moving anyway, towards something worth moving toward, even when the distance between where you were and where you needed to be seemed too large to measure. He had been an A designation in a system that killed A designations. He had survived it. He had cut off his own hand. He had kept going. There is something in that worth holding on to in the dark. Close your eyes a little more. Let your thoughts go slower. We are coming into the final stretch of what tonight has to say, and what remains is the part of the story that is least about institutions and plans and the terrible arithmetic of survival, and most about the nature of the world itself, about what is happening at the level of biology and the dead, about the slow and unsettling evolution of a threat that the characters in this universe are only just beginning to understand. The walkers in the first season of The Walking Dead were frightening in the way that things are frightening when you encounter them for the first time and have no framework for understanding them. They were fast enough to be dangerous, slow enough to be survivable if you kept your head, and consistent enough in their behaviour that Rick Grimes and the survivors around him were able to develop working rules for dealing with them relatively quickly. Noise attracted them. Stillness confused them. A blade to the base of the skull stopped them. Distance kept you safe. These were learnable rules. They were terrifying rules to have to learn in real time, in the middle of a world that had already collapsed around you. But they were learnable. They were survivable, and across the seasons of the show, the communities that Rick built and led and protected demonstrated repeatedly that human beings could adapt to a world defined by those rules and find ways to live inside them. What the expanded universe eventually revealed was that those rules were not the whole picture. They were the rules for one version of the walkers, the version that had emerged in the United States in the early period after the outbreak. They were accurate as far as they went, but they described only a subset of what the wildfire virus was actually capable of producing. The variants existed at the edges of the story for years before the show addressed them directly. There were hints in the early seasons, characters who described walkers that seemed to behave oddly, that appeared to navigate environments with more purpose than the standard shambling dead, that seemed to remember something about where they were. Aaron, a recruiter for Alexandria, who had spent significant time moving through the outside world before Rick's group arrived, mentioned them once in a way that was easy to miss if you were not listening for it. He described walkers that came back to places they remembered. Walkers that could climb walls and open doors. He had heard stories, he said. He was not sure if they were true. He hoped they were not. They were true. The variant strains of the wildfire virus produced walkers that operated by meaningfully different rules from the standard model. The categories that the law assembled over time were distinct from each other, but shared a common characteristic. They demonstrated a level of biological and behavioural capability that the original Walker model had not exhibited, in ways that made the existing adaptive strategies developed by survivors significantly less reliable. Lurkers were perhaps the most psychologically disturbing of the identified variants in a quiet way, because their danger was a function of something so simple that it was easy to underestimate. A lurker entered a state of dormancy. It stopped moving. It stopped making noise. It found a position in a corridor or a room or behind a piece of furniture or inside a vehicle, and it became still. Not because it was dying, not because it was damaged, but because it had adopted a strategy. And the word strategy is the uncomfortable word here. The word that begins to blur the line between behaviour and cognition, of waiting for something to come to it. A survivor who had learned to read a space for signs of movement, who had developed the instinct to check for walkers by listening and watching, who had gotten good at the quick visual scan that told you whether a room was clear. That survivor was operating on an assumption that would not hold with a lurker present. The room looked clear. The room felt clear. Everything the survivor had learned about reading environments for threat was telling them it was safe to proceed, and the lurker was still there, in the corner, behind the desk, inside the car, waiting for the warmth and sound and biological presence of a living person to move within reach. Roamers carried a different kind of weight. A roamer was a walker that had retained some fragment of geographical memory from its life, not consciousness, not recognition in any way that could constitute emotional experience, but the orientation toward place that had been encoded deep enough in the brain's architecture to survive the reanimation process and the transition to whatever the wildfire virus made of a dead nervous system. A roamer came back to a neighbourhood, to a house, to the particular building where it had spent years of its life, and whose spatial layout was apparently imprinted somewhere in the tissue of its brain in a way that the virus did not fully erase. It returned to those places and moved through them with a quality that was not quite navigation but was also not the random, directionless shambling of a standard walker. The inhabitants of post-collapse communities had found roamers in their settlements before, had found them in houses that had once been inhabited by people, moving through familiar rooms with the half-remembered logic of muscle memory operating without a mind behind it. The body going through the motions of a life that the person inside it was no longer able to experience. There was something in that image that resisted comfortable categorization. It was not just scary, it was something else, something that sat between horror and grief, that asked you to think about what memory was and where it lived and what survived the death of the person it belonged to. Climbers were operationally dangerous in a way that was more straightforward but no less significant. A climber could scale surfaces that standard walkers could not. It could navigate the vertical dimension of an environment, could ascend walls and fences, and the kinds of obstacles that survivors had come to rely on as reliable barriers. The security assumptions that communities had built their infrastructure around, the height of their walls, the design of their fences, the positioning of their watchtowers, were assumptions built on the behavioural baseline of standard walkers. A walker that could climb rewritten those assumptions entirely. It made every structure that had been designed for defensive security less reliable, and it did so without announcing itself in advance. The variants in France were another category entirely, and the distinction mattered because what had happened in France had not happened in the United States, simply through the natural evolution of the virus. It had happened through human intervention. The French research teams at La Biomédecine DDMI had altered the virus in their attempt to fight it, producing a variant strain that accelerated reanimation and enhanced the physical capabilities of the resulting walkers. The specific category of walker that emerged from this alteration was more aggressive, more capable, and more dangerous than the standard model in ways that the survivors Daryl Dixon encountered in France were still, years after the outbreak, working out how to manage. The burner variant was the most extreme example. Burner walkers did not simply infect through bites or scratches or the standard transmission mechanisms that the survivors had learned to avoid. They transmitted through contact alone, their bodies generating a heat and a chemical reaction that spread through living tissue when it came into contact with them, creating burns that were not simply wounds, but were themselves vectors for a modified infection that continued to spread through the body independently of any further walker contact. The nuns at the Abbey of St. Bernadette, who had survived in France through a combination of isolation and accumulated knowledge about the specific nature of the walkers in their region, had determined that cauterization was the most effective, immediate response, cutting off the spreading infection the way you would cut off a limb to stop a bite from reaching the bloodstream in an environment with standard walkers. The principle was similar. The urgency was greater. There was a further layer to the French situation, one that moved from the natural evolution of the virus into deliberate weaponization. The organization known as Pouvoir du Vivant had developed a serum that could be administered to an already reanimated walker after the fact, altering its biology to produce a more extreme version of the variant. They had a supply of this serum and the infrastructure to apply it systematically. They were not simply observing the variants as a natural phenomenon. They were manufacturing them, directing their development, deploying the enhanced dead as a resource in pursuit of their own objectives. The dead were no longer simply the dead. In France, in the hands of people willing to use them this way, they had become weapons. This trajectory, from accidental creation to natural variation to deliberate weaponization, was the disturbing arc that the Walking Dead universe had been building toward in its expanded storyline. It was not the arc that most people who had watched the original show would have predicted when Rick Grimes walked out of that hospital into the empty streets of Georgia and found the girl with the ruined face. It was a different and darker arc than the one that begins with the dead simply rising and ends with the living learning to survive them. This arc ended somewhere considerably less comfortable. It ended in a place where the dead were not simply a natural disaster to be endured, but a tool that human beings with the right knowledge and the wrong ethics could shape and direct and deploy against other human beings. It ended in a place where the distinction between the monsters outside the walls and the humans inside them had become, in certain contexts, genuinely difficult to maintain. The Walking Dead began, in spirit and in premise, as a story about community. It was always saying, underneath the horror and the violence and the endless loss, that people needed each other. That isolation killed you, not just physically, but in every other way that mattered. That the things worth surviving for were other people, their presence, their particular qualities, the texture of their voices, and their habits, and their ways of being in the world. Rick Grimes was the character who embodied this thesis most completely, who had been built by the show to demonstrate it over and over again across 15 years of storytelling. He was a person who survived because he kept choosing the people around him over the easier alternatives. Not always wisely, not always without enormous cost, but consistently, as a matter of character rather than strategy. And what the expanded universe built around that central thesis was a structure that tested it at every level. At the level of the virus, everyone is infected. The threat is already inside you. The most intimate part of your biology is complicit in the apocalypse. At the level of the science, the people who created the threat were trying to help, were doing work they believed was important, and made an error so catastrophic that the consequences consumed the world. At the level of the institution, the most powerful organization in the post-collapse United States had decided that the only path to survival required making decisions that were incompatible with the values that made survival worth having. At the level of the individual, the person who had most fully embodied the show's thesis about community and human connection spent years isolated, cut off, in captivity, fighting a system too large to fight in any of the ways he was best at. It was a complete and terrible architecture. It held together in the way that the best and darkest storytelling always holds together, not by being nihilistic or hopeless, but by being honest about the full weight of the thing it was examining. It did not say that community was impossible, or that human beings were fundamentally incapable of choosing each other over the easier alternatives. It said that the pressure to abandon those choices was real and enormous and constant, and that making them anyway in the face of all that pressure was where the meaning lived. The dead are born here. The walls were not safe. The city you trusted was using your trust as a shield for its crimes. The person you loved was alive somewhere you could not reach. The infection was already inside you, had always been inside you, would be inside you until you died. And somehow, in the face of all of that, people kept going, kept finding each other, kept building things that were worth building, even knowing they might not last, kept choosing the hard version of survival over the easier one over and over again in ways that were impractical and costly, and also the only things worth doing. That is the story underneath the story. That is what the darkness was always in service of. Not the darkness itself, not the horror for its own sake, but the particular quality of light that only becomes visible when you have been in the dark long enough to know what you're looking at. Let yourself be still now. Let the night outside be whatever the night outside is, its particular silence or its particular sounds, the quality of the darkness in the room around you. You have moved through a great deal of heavy material tonight. You have sat with truths that were built to be uncomfortable, that were designed to ask something of the people who encountered them. You do not need to carry any of it with you into sleep. It will all be here when you wake up. if you want to return to it. The architecture of the Walking Dead universe, the virus, and the laboratory, and the city, and the army, and the 14 years, and the man who cut off his own hand to try to get home. None of it goes anywhere. The story is told, the weight is out in the open, where it can be acknowledged and then carefully set down. Set it down. Your breath is the only thing that needs your attention right now. Long and slow and regular, moving in and out with the kind of rhythm that your body already knows. The rhythm it found on its own in the hours after you were born, and has been following ever since without needing instruction. Let it do that now. Let it carry you into the quiet. The night is long, and you are safe, and the world outside is whatever it is, which is not your concern for the next few hours. Your concern for the next few hours is this: rest, sleep, the particular restoration that only comes from letting go completely, from releasing the hold your waking mind keeps on all the threads of what has to be done, and what has already been done, and what might happen and what might not. The Walking Dead was always, in the end, about what was worth holding on to, about what deserved to be carried forward and what could safely be left behind, about the difference between the weight that sustains you and the weight that breaks you, about learning, through the impossible pressures of an impossible world, which was which. You know what is worth holding on to tonight. You have been holding it all day. Now let the rest of it go. The dead are quiet. The world is still. The only thing moving is your breathing. Slow and regular and continuous. A bridge from where you are to where you're going. Let it carry you across. But before we allow the quiet to fully take hold, there are two more pieces of the Walking Dead universe that deserve their place in this accounting. Two threads that the expanded story carried into its most recent chapters, threads that spoke to the persistence of the world's darkness in ways that were smaller in institutional scale, but no less revealing about the nature of what survival required of the people attempting it. The first was New York City, years after the events of the main series, after the wars and the rebuilding and the slow construction of something resembling a functional society in the communities of the Commonwealth and Alexandria and the other settlements that had found their footing in the post-collapse landscape. New York City existed as a place that had not been recovered. It could not be recovered, not in any reasonable timeline. The density of walkers in the island of Manhattan, millions of people had been living there when the outbreak began, and millions of walkers had inherited it, made the kind of clearance and repopulation that had worked in smaller communities essentially impossible. The dead outnumbered anything that could be organised against them in that space by a margin that made sustained occupation unviable. Manhattan had become, in the years since the collapse, simply the dead city, a monument to what the old world had been, preserved in its physical architecture, but fundamentally transformed in every other way. Maggie Rhee went there anyway. She went there because her son was there. Herschel, named for her father, had been kidnapped by a man called the Croat, a former saviour, a one-time member of Negan's original organisation who had become a warlord controlling Manhattan with his gang, the Barazi. The Croat had taken Herschel to use as leverage, specifically to force Maggie to deliver Negan to Manhattan, where the city's power broker, a figure known as the Dharma, wanted Negan to unite and lead the island's gangs. To get her son back, Maggie had done the unthinkable. She had tracked down Negan, the man who had killed her husband Glenn in front of her years earlier, and asked him for his help. The two of them had gone to Manhattan together, bound by necessity, separated by everything that had happened between them, and carrying between them one of the most complicated and morally contested relationships the entire franchise had ever produced. New York City, in the Walking Dead universe, was not simply a place full of walkers. It had developed its own internal ecology, its own power structures in the decades since the collapse. People lived there, not in safety, not in the organised community sense that the Commonwealth or Alexandria represented, but in the precarious way that people who have become expert in navigating an environment that should kill them can sometimes manage to persist. They lived in the vertical spaces above the streets, in the upper floors of buildings that the walkers could not easily reach. They had developed economic systems and territorial arrangements and the social codes of a population that had spent years in close proximity to enormous and constant danger. The dead had shaped them. The conditions of existence in Manhattan had produced a particular kind of person, adapted to that specific environment in ways that were not easily translatable to anywhere else. What this said about the Walking Dead universe, in the context of everything else the expanded story had revealed, was that the process of adaptation to the world of the dead was not a uniform process. It did not produce the same results in all environments. The Civic Republic's adaptation had produced an institution that committed genocide in the name of survival. New York's adaptation had produced human communities that had learned to coexist with millions of walkers in a density that made most other settings look manageable by comparison. Fear the Walking Dead, the earliest spin-off series, had traced the initial days of the collapse on the West Coast, showing how different communities and different individuals processed the same catastrophic information in ways that reflected their particular circumstances and psychology. Daryl Dixon showed what survival in France looked like under the pressures created by the more aggressive and varied walker strains that the French research had produced. The Walking Dead universe, in its fullest expression, was not a story about a single experience of apocalypse. It was a story about the enormous variety of ways that human beings responded to the same fundamental catastrophe, producing outcomes that ranged from the quietly heroic to the institutionally monstrous, depending on the resources available and the decisions made and the specific pressures that each environment created. None of the outcomes were simple. None of the people inside them were uncomplicated. The communities that had found ways to survive had done so through a mixture of courage and luck and sacrifice and, in many cases, compromises that their inhabitants had to find ways to live with afterward. There was a line from Okafor's story that stayed with Rick Grimes, and that the show used to anchor something important about this world. Okafor had described the fire on his family's farm when he was a child, the fire that his father had started deliberately, burning the crops to save the farm from a failure that was coming regardless of what they did. A controlled destruction that looked from the outside like catastrophe, that looked to a frightened 7-year-old watching from a window like the end of everything. His father had told him that the flames were protecting the plants for the next harvest, that what looked like the end of the world was really just the beginning, that the scars and the pain that came from it were what reminded you that you had saved something. This was the frame through which Okafor had tried to understand the CRM. He had tried to hold Beale's decisions inside this frame, to see the destruction as controlled as the fire that saved the farm. He had not been able to hold it there, not entirely, not after he understood the full scale of what Beale intended, but the frame itself was not wrong. The idea that the worst moments of this world were not simply the end of things, but the beginning of others, that survived its application to the CRM because it was true independent of any specific institution's choices. The world of The Walking Dead, in all its horror and loss and institutional darkness, had produced people who were trying, not always successfully, not without enormous cost, but trying persistently and specifically to build something that was worth the price of what they had been through. That persistence is the thing that outlasted every darkness the story put in front of it. Not hope in the easy sense, not the comfortable certainty that things would work out, but something harder and more durable than hope. The specific decision, made again and again in impossible circumstances, to treat the people around you as though they were worth the effort, to build walls that might be broken and grow crops that might fail, and make alliances that might be betrayed, and love people who might be taken from you in any of the 1,000 ways this world provided. To do all of that knowing the full cost and doing it anyway, because the alternative, the Civic Republic military's alternative, the fortress and the gas and the classified briefing and the 14-year timeline and the elimination of everyone who might constitute a future threat. That alternative was not survival. That was the fire that burned everything and never let the harvest come. The dead are quiet tonight. Let the night do what nights do. Let the room hold you solid and real, and let whatever weight you have been carrying through this conversation settle somewhere that is not your body and not your mind. It will be there tomorrow if you need it. Tonight it has said what it has to say. Everything else can wait. There is something about the way sleep comes that has always resembled faintly the things the Walking Dead was always examining. The way consciousness lets go. The way the grip of the waking mind, that persistent, effortful, slightly anxious grip on the thread of what is happening and what needs to happen next, softens and releases without you ever being able to identify exactly the moment when it happened. You cannot choose the moment of sleep the way you choose to stand up or sit down. You can only create the conditions for it and then release the effort of trying to make it happen and let the body do what it knows how to do. The Walking Dead was always, underneath all of its other concerns, a story about that kind of release, about the things you had to be willing to let go of in order to survive. Not in the surrendering sense, not in the sense of giving up on what mattered, but in the sense of trusting that some things would take care of themselves if you stopped gripping them so tightly. That community did not require perfect control to function, that people did not require perfect information to make good decisions, that the future did not need to be perfectly secured before it was worth working toward. Rick Grimes had held on through things that would have broken any reasonable grip. He had held on in a hospital room in Georgia with flowers wilting around him and machines that had stopped beeping. He had held on in a tank surrounded by walkers with a radio playing static and no clear path forward. He had held on in the Civic Republic with one hand and no visible exit, and the years accumulating between him and the people who were somewhere out there, alive or not, loving him or not, waiting or not. He held on, not because he was certain it would work, not because the math of the situation supported holding on, because letting go was not an option that contained anything worth containing, because somewhere on the other side of all that distance and difficulty, there were people whose presence in the world justified the effort of continuing to exist. You're on the right side of everything tonight. The dark outside the window is ordinary dark, the kind that dissolves in the morning, the way all ordinary dark does. The weight of the day has been carried as far as it needed to be carried. The weight of this story, with all its disturbing architecture, and its 14-year timelines, and its hidden cities and its laboratories, and its singular, stubborn human persistence, has been said and acknowledged and set down. Your breathing is slow. Your body knows what it is doing. The room is real and stable, and holding you up the way it always does, the way it will continue to do through the hours between now and morning. Before the quiet takes you completely, there is one more thing worth carrying into sleep. There is a detail that appears in the very first episode of The Walking Dead that most people filed away as a piece of visual atmosphere and never returned to. Rick Grimes, having woken in the hospital, having made his way out into the ruined world, rides a bicycle through the streets of his neighborhood and comes eventually to his own home. He goes inside. He calls for his wife and his son. He finds nothing. No answer, no presence, no sign of them that tells him anything useful. He goes back outside and sits on the steps of the house in his hospital gown, and he begins to cry. It is a small and human moment inside a story that will eventually become enormous. A man on the steps of his house in a world that has ended, crying for the people he cannot find. Not a warrior, not a survivor in any operational sense yet. Just a person who woke up alone in a place that used to be filled with the people he loved. That image was always what the show was really about. Everything else, the CRM and the French laboratory and the echelon briefing and the 14 years and the variants and the hidden city and all the enormous architecture of what the expanded universe eventually constructed. All of that was the world that surrounded that image. The world that pressed in on it and tested it and tried again and again to make it impossible. The image survived. The man on the steps grieving for his people, not knowing yet whether he would find them, not knowing yet what the world had become or what it would require of him. That man made his way through all of it, sat on those steps and then stood up and then began. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough.